You know, everywhere you look, it seems like there's this constant pressure to reinvent, to update, to make things more accessible. But what if the most powerful thing you could do was simply preserve something? Today, we're going to dive into a story about Christian worship that really challenges our modern ideas. A story about two ancient traditions, East and West, and what happens when they collide.
So this quote right here, this is our starting point. It's from a guy who grew up his entire life in the Western Roman Catholic tradition. And one day, he steps into an Eastern Catholic divine liturgy for the very first time, and the experience was so profound, so completely different, that it shifted his entire perspective on faith, on worship, on everything. It's this powerful, almost sensory collision of worlds that we're going to unpack.
So what exactly was it that felt so different? This slide really lays it out. See, in his Western experience, there was often this quiet, reflective vibe, a big focus on the crucifixion, with pews for sitting and kneeling. Pretty standard stuff for many of us. But in the East, whoa, he found a space that was all about the resurrection. There was constant song, constant movement, people making full prostrations. The walls weren't just decorated, they were literally covered in icons, each one telling a story. And instead of a simple altar rail, there was this massive wall of icons, an iconostasis, that separated the sanctuary, giving you this sense of profound mystery. It was a total immersion for the senses.
Now, that feeling, that visceral difference, it isn't just about aesthetics or, cultural flavor. It's actually rooted in something much, much deeper, in the very foundation of how the early church saw itself. And to really get why these differences are so huge, we have to go way back to the very beginning.
This is the big question, right? Because the answer isn't just about style or personal preference. It's about something that really challenges a super common modern idea about where Christianity even comes from. So let's start peeling back the layers.
Here's the first part of what, for a lot of people, is a pretty radical idea. The assumption is often that Christianity is a religion built out of a book, right? That a bunch of people got together with the Bible and then built a church from it.
And here's the twist, the part that just flips the whole script. The historical reality is that the church, with its teachings, its leadership structure, its worship, especially the Eucharist, existed before the New Testament was ever put together into the single book we have today. The Bible came out of the life of the church, not the other way around.
And this slide, I think, really makes it clear. Just look at the dates. The church's teaching authority is there from the start. The Eucharist is considered essential to the faith more than 280 years before the New Testament canon is even finalized. When big arguments popped up, early Christians didn't just grab their personal Bibles. They didn't have them. They looked to this living chain of authority, what we call apostolic succession. See, tradition wasn't some secondary thing. It was the very air they breathed, the context in which the scriptures were written, saved, and understood. Okay, so understanding that tradition came first is key, because it helps us understand why a seemingly tiny change to a ritual could have gigantic, earth-shattering consequences. Let's look at this absolutely wild case study from 17th century Russia, where a fight over how to make the sign of the cross literally tore the church in two.
So here's the setup. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time, a guy named Patriarch Nikon, decides that Russian worship has kind of drifted away from its Greek roots. His goal was to standardize everything, to get it all back in line with the rest of the Orthodox world. The problem? For the Russian people, this didn't feel like a correction. It felt like an attack on the faith their ancestors had passed down for centuries.
And this slide just perfectly shows the flashpoints. To us, today, these reforms might seem so minor. Changing how many fingers you use for the sign of the cross, reversing the way you walk around the church, editing some books to fix what they thought were spelling mistakes. But for the people back then, these weren't just details. This was their sacred inheritance. This was everything.
And here's where you see the deep theology packed into that simple gesture. The old way, with 2 fingers, was like a mini sermon every time you did it, confessing the 2 natures of Christ, that he was both divine and human. To them, the new way, using 3 fingers for the Trinity, was dangerously close to heresy, and implied that the entire Trinity was crucified on the cross, not just the Son. This wasn't just changing a habit. For the group that became known as the Old Believers, this was a betrayal of a fundamental truth.
The resistance was led by this incredibly fiery priest named Avakum, and this quote from him, it's just shocking. The mysteries he's talking about, that's the Eucharist, what they believe is the actual body and blood of Christ. He was arguing that the Reformed Church's sacraments weren't just invalid, they were literally poisonous. That's how high the stakes were. This wasn't a debate, it was spiritual warfare.
So, this story of the Old Believers isn't just some dusty old piece of history.
It speaks directly to conversations that are happening right now about tradition, about change, and about the very essence of what worship is.
And boom, here we are, full circle back to where we started. Leaders in the Western Church are now looking east, and they're admitting that something vital, this sense of mystery, has been kept alive in those ancient liturgies. It's almost like an admission that the West, in all of its own development, might have lost something that the East managed to hold on to.
So the crucial point here is this warning against these modern ways of thinking that can just strip worship of all its depth. Utilitarianism, for instance, might look at a long-chanted liturgy and just see something inefficient. Consumerism might demand that worship feel more like a rock concert. The call here is to protect these ancient traditions from getting flattened by our desire for convenience or entertainment.
One idea for a path forward is a return to a model called synodality. And this isn't some newfangled idea. It's meant to reflect how the early church made big decisions, together, collaboratively, through councils and a lot of listening. It's a move away from a purely top-down system, and it looks a lot more like how the Eastern churches have operated for centuries. The hope is that it could allow for more diversity within a unified faith.
This all brings us to this really powerful, unifying metaphor for how these two great traditions, East and West, can see each other, not as rivals, but as essential parts of a single whole. I just love this image. It suggests that the universal church has two lungs, the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition. A body can't be healthy breathing with only one lung, right? The idea is that for the church to be fully alive, to be fully itself, it needs both. Each tradition has saved these incredible treasures that the other needs, and they're meant to complete and enrich each other.
And so we end right back where we began. In our culture that prizes innovation and the next new thing above everything else, the experience of these ancient liturgies poses a really profound question. What is the wisdom, the power, and the value in a tradition that isn't trying to be new, but is simply trying to be faithful? What do we gain when we don't just reinvent, but instead we inherit? That's definitely something to think about.